months later, I said, let's all go out to drinks and, grab a couple of beers, ask the staff, see what they think. She comes back, she goes, nah, nobody really wants to go. I was like, okay, maybe I'm the problem. I said, what's my problem? She goes, a lot of Chinese don't like to drink because their face gets very red after even just one drink. So she goes, they don't want to go with their boss. And, in America, they don't give a damn, right? They'll go and drink more than the boss. But, in China, they don't want to do that, so they don't want to be embarrassed. So I said, well, what would they rather do? And she said, they'd rather go karaoke. I said, the hell with it, I'm not going. So again, you have to really kind of appreciate the cultural context, right? Having a beer with somebody in New York does not translate the same way somewhere else. So if you're in Hong Kong, I'd recommend you try karaoke. My fifth management tip or leadership lesson is take risks, but be aware, and then more importantly, be self-aware. It's very, very important. So a lot of people, you hear this, right? Take risks, you got to do it, and and they do. But you have to just, I think, there's the self-awareness is very important. So let me just give you a little story. This is a true story. None of these stories are made up, so they're all true, for the most part. How they played out might have been different, but I'm telling it hopefully a better way than what actually happened. So when I was in Hong Kong, one of the things we used to do, there used to be a lot of project financings back in the early 90s, mid-90s, in places like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, for power plants and cell towers and whatever, telecom, whatnot. So one of my favorite places that I used to go was Jakarta. So and it was always it was usually once a month. I've probably been to Jakarta, I don't know, 50 times now. And it was always Sunday night. You catch the last flight on Cathay Pacific. You get there at 8 o'clock at the airport. It takes you 2 hours to get to the hotel. So you're in the hotel by 10 at night. You're there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Wednesday night you come back to Hong Kong, and you're back home. So, you kind of get into this rhythm, and you do it many, many times, and, you exactly know what suits you're going to take, what ties you're going to take, what hotel you're going to be in, and you're in this pattern. So this was like one of my, normal Sunday to Wednesday runs to Jakarta. I get to the airport, 8 o'clock, and I'm in the hotel by 8:30, and I'm thinking, and I wasn't paying attention, so I'm thinking, there's no traffic today. That's really nice. I might even have time for a dinner. So I go up to my room and order room service. And 10 o'clock, I'm in bed. I go to sleep. And so the next morning, I get up, at 7 o'clock, I'm down. And I said, the Chase office was literally a mile away from the Van Hyatt. If anybody has been to Jakarta, you know that. You can see the building. And I always take a taxi, it's $2 or $3, and you go to the Chase office, which is a mile away. So I get to the the ground floor, and I said, I'd like to get a taxi, please. I'm going to the Chase office. And the guy says, no, take a hotel car. I'm like, the hotel car costs $25. The taxi is $2, and me being cheap, I said, listen, no, just get me a taxi. And the guy's like, no, please take a hotel car. And I said, listen, I've been to Jakarta many times, not my first time. I don't need a hotel car. I'm not paying $25. Just give me a taxi. He goes, no taxi. So I'm like getting really annoyed and irritated. And so he goes, let me call the manager. His English wasn't great. My Bahasa was non-existent, so we were struggling. So he gets the manager. The manager comes over and says, listen, we're not going to charge you, it's free, but please take the hotel card. Now I'm thinking, okay, I'm a gold guest, I had gold platinum card holder, so they're treating me nice, they're giving me a nice Mercedes, free transportation. This is really nice. I was like, oh, thank you very much. And the guy said, are you sure you want to go? I said, absolutely I want to go, I have to go to work, I'm here until Wednesday. So I get in the car, and literally the 1 mile drive was very surreal, right? There was no people on the street. And I'm thinking, this is really odd. So I get to the parking lot, and there are military police everywhere. There are 18-year-old kids with machine guns. And I called our country manager, Lieutenant Morgan McGrath, from the parking lot. I said, Morgan, what is going on? And he goes, have you not been watching CNN or the news? There's been a coup here in the country. And that was the weekend they overthrew Suharto. And he goes, what the hell are you doing? I said, I just took the flight. There was no traffic. I was in the hotel in 30 minutes. I thought it was like really cool. He goes, we got to figure out how to get you back. So anyway, long story short, they wouldn't let us go back to the hotel because at that time the Hyatt was owned 10% by Suharto's son, and they were afraid that people were going to bomb the hotel or do something. So we actually had to go to this other hotel called the Regent, and I'm sure many of you have been to Jakarta know this, which was kind of in the back, and then literally about 3 days later, we had to get into an armored car and get to the airport. Then there were about 3 or 4 firms that got a plane and whatever. And we went to Singapore and then made our way back to Hong Kong. So you can imagine my wife at the time. We had 2 little kids. One was about 5, the other one was about 18 months. And she's watching CNN, and she's like, what's going on? And I was like, listen, nothing, everything is fine, don't worry about it, we're all good. But, it really wasn't that good. And she knew it, but, you just kind of, hope that everything works out, right? So again, my only point here is, you should take risks, but you should just be aware of, what it is and the context around you. So at a minimum, just watch CNN before you get on a flight, that might be a good thing. And by the way, the other rule that that I always do, and maybe many of you do, is whenever I get to a local place, wherever, whether it's in Edinburgh or London or Jakarta, wherever, I always get the local paper and try to read that, right? Because then it's not just about it's just awareness, right? You just have to it's impossible for any individual to know everything that's going on in 150 countries. You just cannot. So you have to just kind of figure out mechanisms to kind of de-risk these situations. Number 6. So be a mentor to someone. It can really change your life. Again, this is one that I think some cultures do it much better than others. I don't know where Indians fall, whether we're good at that or not. But for me, transformationally, there have been, I would say, 2 or 3 people in my life that have been very, very instrumental. My dad was a librarian when we came to this country. My mother worked as a secretary, pretty typical immigrant, no money. They were all educated, they all had degrees, and the only thing we knew was, the kids were going to get education, and that was going to be sort of the path, if you will, the way forward. But, what for me was very important was I never knew growing up as a kid what gets said in a boardroom. I didn't know what the CEO conversation was. And so for me, it was very, very helpful, throughout the course of my career where I had a couple of, very instrumental, mentors, that really helped me. And again, there's a difference between having a mentor and a sponsor. A mentor is somebody that generally gives you advice, but a sponsor is somebody that takes an active interest in you to promote you and pull you up, right, over time. And I think that's really important, right? So one of the things I would recommend all of you do, whether it's in your firm or outside your firm, it's really help people understand what that dialogue is that happens at the top of the house. And by the way, this is not something that stops at a certain age. It's something that's continuous, throughout your life. And it's quite interesting. Gerald Hassel, who's our CEO for, the Bank of New York, I see him, because I go on a lot of calls or meetings, with clients, we take Gerald. And it's quite interesting to me when we go on these meetings, even though he's the CEO and he runs a very important bank, he's constantly asking for feedback and advice from different people that we meet. So again, I think that's really important, to have a mentor or a sponsor, somebody you can turn to. So I would recommend it because it really can change a person's life, right? So it really is not about yourself, it's really about how do you give back. And I think that's something that really has to be part of a leader's DNA, because I think that's just very, very important. Number 7, you really need the full support of not just the company, but also the family, especially if you want to have a global kind of an experience. By the way, not everybody wants to travel the world, and that's perfectly fine. But if you do, and that's part of your desire, having the company and the family support you is absolutely critical. And again, a classic example is I remember I was on this monster trip, It was about 3 weeks long, just when we were in Hong Kong. I had to go to Australia, I had to go to Tokyo, then I had to go to the US, the West Coast, East Coast, London. And you come home like 3 weeks later and you're absolutely exhausted. And I come in and I'm thinking, okay, I'm finally home. I can have a good meal, I can go to sleep tonight, and it'll be great, right? And it's a Friday. So I get home, it's like, I open the door and my wife is there with my second daughter, who must have been about 6 months old at the time. And I remember her distinctly saying this, because she never said this again. She said, "This is your child, you take care of it." And she gave me the baby. I had the luggage in my hand, I'm at the doorway. She goes, "This is your child." And I take the 6-month-old kid, and she runs into the bedroom, and she locks the door, because I heard it. And I was like, first of all, where am I going to sleep? 2, what am I going to do with the 6-month-old kid? I have no idea what to do. And I'm like, I think I know where to feed. I think I know where the stuff comes out. And literally, but that's really very important, right? Because you just think that, oh, this stuff just happens. It doesn't just happen, right? So that for me was very important. And by the way, we were both working. She went to NYU. She got her MBA. She worked at Morgan Stanley for a number of years. Then she worked at PwC. So again, working at a professional firm, it was easy to get jobs, in Hong Kong and London. And you forget that both of you are working, both of you have this lifestyle, but somehow she's got all the responsibility for the kids. And so we really have to sit down and say, look, if we want to continue this global lifestyle, we have to figure out a way to make it work, for both parties. And of course, that's when we got our live-in nanny, a lady named Arlene. And by the way, she was with us for 12 years. And she became like a second mother. And that's kind of how we coped, because we were both working. So it really is important that you have that compromise and figure out what that is, because otherwise it just becomes very one-sided. And you really can't succeed, because there's a lot of stress. And the other thing, being in Asia was easy, right? Live-in health is very, very easy. We got very lucky, like I said, with this lady. And, she's now like a part of the family. I mean, we've known her for 20 years, and she goes to every wedding and every funeral, every, whatever, engagement. She's just part of the fabric in terms of, and the other thing is it's also, they know every argument that you have, right? So again, I think if you're from India, having, domestic help or driver cook, that's all part of the DNA. For us, we grew up in the US. Now, suddenly to have another person in the house, it just feels really intrusive. So it takes some time to get used to that. It took me about 10 minutes to get used to it, because I was like, this is great, she's doing all the work. Let her do it. For my wife, it took about a month. But anyway, you have to kind of make that adjustment, and it's really just, kind of important. So again, don't assume it's just about you. It's also about your partner and your firm. That's really going to drive your success. So just, be mindful of that. Couple more. Actively seek out feedback and be receptive to change, right? So, the best gift in the world is a mirror, right? It's free. You have the ability to look at yourself every day, every minute, not to look at how beautiful you might be. I mean, you could do that as well, but to really be reflective of, what you're coming across like. So again, I think to do that, if you carry a mirror around the boardroom every day, there people will be, laughing at you. But the feedback is very important, right? So you have to have people that have the courage to give it, and you have to, more importantly, have the courage to receive it. And there have been many, many times, everybody kind of assumes that, there are some people whose careers are meteoric and they just kind of grow exponentially. For many people, it's more of a random walk. It goes up, it comes down, it goes up, but over a long time, hopefully it's up. And part of that is being able to get feedback, at different points in your career to really react, to adjust, and to do things. The other thing also, this is an age thing. What I would say is, in your 30s and, maybe early 40s, you learn to become a manager. When you're 40s and 50s, you grow to become a leader. And they're two very, very different things, right? Being a manager is all about you and your abilities. Being a leader is all about everybody else and your ability to drive other people, right? So very different skill sets, and they don't always teach you that. right? And sometimes you have to learn it the hard way. And that's why, again, I think if you are able to get feedback, you can really understand the difference and really make that transition from being a great manager to a great leader, which hopefully all of us can do, in our careers. 9 and 10, coming to the end of the line. Number 9, I think I got number 9, yeah, is network. Simple, right? There's no substitute for network, right? And by the way, opportunities like this is really an opportunity to network, to stay connected. And by the way, it's so much easier now to network. When I was, many of you guys, I'm sure, 20, 30 years ago, you had letters, right, that you wrote. You didn't have email, you didn't have text, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have LinkedIn. So it's a lot easier to just stay plugged in and network, but it's a really important skill. Now, a lot of people think, okay, networking for what purpose, right? And again, this is where I firmly believe you stay networked not to help yourself, you stay networked to help other people, right? And again, I think you have to have that selflessness. If you're networking and your intent is to get something out of that relationship, people see right through that and it's a turnoff, right? So I would really ask you to think about networking as a way to get great ideas, to get feedback, and an opportunity to help people succeed. And trust me, when you help other people, you will automatically be more successful, and all the benefits will accrue to you. But you don't have to, do it with a different purpose. So again, network is very important, but make sure you have the right frame of reference in terms of why you're doing it. And finally, this is kind of something that I tell people in my work is, which is number 10, work your current job, not your next one. A lot of times people make the mistake, they're a director, they want to be a managing director, so they're trying to work the managing director, right, role. Don't do that. Be a great director, right? And interestingly, as Indians, I think I can use the Mahabharata and the Gita as an example, right? Everybody understands Krishna's speech and really about selfless action. You do it because it's a duty as opposed to because you want something, from that relationship. So again, I think work is the same way, right? You do your job, you do it really well, and the next job may come, it may not come, but you shouldn't really worry about it. And what I find more than often than not is that successful business people, successful leaders are really thinking about the current context. They're very self-aware of other things, but really just focus on in the moment, be in the moment, and I think you'll accrue far greater benefits from that than trying to work your next job or trying to think about being the CEO of the business. And by the way, all of us have the capability to do all of those things, but you don't have to really focus and get fixated on that. So anyway, that's sort of my I don't know. I think I'm coming up on time here. So that's just a little bit of my leadership tips.
Very interesting points. Very inspiring. I think so. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So you certainly made a lot of points and more power to you. I do want to take the opportunity to see if the audience wants to ask you some questions.
Sure.
And I'm sure people are eager to share some more. Okay. Thank you.
Hi Samir, wonderful talk.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Manush. I'm from IIM Connect, 2008 batch. I like the story that you talked about the karaoke in Hong Kong. I was posted in Manila for a year, and fortunately or unfortunately, I had to also do a lot of karaoke. So the question was like, how did you break barrier coming from New York, being in a very aggressive society, and going to Hong Kong, which though it's an aggressive city, but Chinese culture, as with Indian culture and other Asian cultures, are more mellowed. So how did you break the barrier?
I think when you first get there, again, this is about all the mistakes, right, that you make, which people don't generally talk about. But I think what you find is that you just don't resonate, right? And you can sense that, right, with people. And you come across, in my case, as being very American and whatnot, right? So again, that's where I think you have to be able to ask people for the feedback. So in my case, I would ask people in my office, what are their suggestions or, what they would recommend. And, and people, I think I've been very lucky because they've been very generous with their feedback. And I think I've been smart enough to just kind of listen to that feedback. But then, I think the other part of this is, when you go to these different places, you have to recognize they're by definition going to be a little different, right? So you have to be a little clever and you have to kind of think about what's common and what's different and then try to translate that in a way that, kind of becomes effective, right? So, I remember like you go to China as an example, you go to a meeting, right? There'd be a long, 2 head chairs and, there would be a long row of table or seating. Like this is back like, 25 years ago, right? So the 2 heads would ask, there was a translator in the middle and a long row of people. And clearly the hierarchy was driven by, the person on the end was the least, whatever, senior person, and the senior people sat at the head table. Now, they'd ask a question, you translate that in Chinese. Now, of course, you don't know the answer. So you pass the question to the next guy, who passes it to the next guy, who then passes it to the third guy. He understands, he knows the answer, the answer comes all the way back, and then the senior person goes through the translator and gives the answer. Now, in an American context, I would just say, look, I know you at the end have the answer, why don't you just please answer the question? And I guess maybe Americans would even answer the question, right? But that's really where you can't do that. You have to wait for the process, for the question to come down, and for the answer to move up, right? It's like a, nerve transmission, right? There's a pattern of, where it goes down and the chemicals come back. And part of it is just understanding that it just takes time and it's different and not trying to make it Americanized, right? Or not trying to make it like your own. Because if you try to do it like you do it, you're going to fail. So you just have to, and it's fun. It's also actually fun to kind of see this and you're kind of like, wow, this is ridiculous, but I'm having a good time just waiting for the answer to come back. And the answer might be yes. Oh, okay.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Yes, Amir, I enjoyed this talk. Everyone knows me, Liz, Anurag Behed. So you talked about leadership skills, and I want to also talk about how much of talent is required along with the skills, the subject matter knowledge that is required and that has been instrumental in your ascent to the top. Is it 60% of people's leadership skills plus 40% of the job, or any kind of distribution that you reply? What are the mix apart from the leadership skill that helps you rise in the company?
So, and again, I don't want to talk about all professions because I think that would be too huge a generalization. But at least in the context of the experience that I've been in, which is banking and financial services, this is one of the things I always think about, right? Which is there are many, many smart people that I worked with, that I worked for, that worked for me. And, and I would say in many cases, there are people that are much smarter than I am. And again, if you believe what I said, which is hire people that are smarter than you, then, by definition, you have a lot of really smart people, right? That's not necessarily my experience. That does not, being the smartest guy in the room does not necessarily translate into the senior job, right? Because I think that's, I would almost say that's a table stakes. You need to have that, but you need to have 3 or 4 other things, right? And I think the 3 or 4 other things, again, my experience, you need to be able to create a vision that unites people, that people can feel like they can follow, they understand, they can get behind. I think that's really important. You need to have, good strategy and good strategic thinking, because you need to be able to anticipate a little bit in terms of the future. In my role, you've got to understand the financials and, the numbers. And again, I think for most Indians, numbers is like, it's not a problem. It just comes pretty naturally, from my experience. But then this is the one for me that's probably the biggest surprise, which I think if I had to redo again my education, I would redo differently, which is I think one of the biggest success factors is really your ability, how you speak, how you write, and and how you communicate, right? I mean, as an engineer, And I was very lucky. I went to Columbia University, so Columbia has, and I went to the engineering school, but even for the engineering school, they had a modified version of the core, what they call the core curriculum. So, you had to read things like Plato and Socrates and the Iliad and, whatever, right? Which at the time I was like, you had a 2-year language requirement, you had to take French. And you'd think, oh my God, this is drudgery, right? I want to take chemical engineering, I want to take, physical chemistry or calculus or differential equations. I think if I had to redo it, I would pay a lot more attention to that, because trust me, I'm not using my differential equations now. I'm not using any of my chemistry. I'm not using any of my physics. But the stuff that I am using is the stuff that I haven't done, right? So I would recommend that people really think about that. And again, I think for many Indians, again, this kind of goes back to, the professor who said, there are certain, Bangladeshi, fabrics, right, have a certain connotation. Indians also have a certain connotation, right? So you have to just be mindful of that, right? I mean, I don't know if you guys read the news today, Richie Verma, who's been nominated as the new ambassador to India. He's the first Indian guy, to be nominated as the ambassador to India from the U.S. He's actually from Western Pennsylvania. My wife and my in-law, they all used to play together as kids. They were like 10 years old with Richie, and it's amazing. Like, Richie went a very different way in terms of his career, and if he gets nominated, he'd be the new ambassador, right? So again, I think that's part of it. And I remember as a kid, his parents would be like, you should study engineering, and you should study math and sciences, and he really paid a lot more attention to. He's a lawyer, so he paid a lot more attention to humanities. So I really recommend people to do that. And by the way, it's never too late, right? I mean, I didn't do it when I was in college as much as I should have. So when I read books now, I try to read a lot of history. I try to read a lot of literature. Partly it's because it's really interesting. Partly it's because I don't have to write an essay at the end of it, so it's much more enjoyable. But partly it's also it keeps you sharp, and it keeps you thinking about that.
Samir, I'd like to add a perspective to what you just said. As you said, when hiring, we've seen corporations giving too much importance to competencies and skills rather than talent, right? So I'd like to just build on that, and came through when you shared your story with us of how you've lived in different parts of India first, then United States, and then all over the globe, right? I think I just wanted to share that emotional intelligence, which we've all heard of, has further been talked about as cultural intelligence. So CQ is coming in as another way of seeing how sensitive we are going to be when we operate across cultures. And obviously CQ skills, like EQ skills, good news, are learnable. Right. So when we were fortunate, like yourself, I too was fortunate to live in all 4 corners of India and thereafter in all the major continents of the planet. I think if you've got that kind of exposure of being able to live with other cultures and become sensitive to them, your EQ and CQ skills, they tend to develop quite easily. And I would therefore encourage all of us in the room to be, firstly, a little bit apprehensive of being culturally too arrogant sometimes, especially when we come from 5,000-year-old, 7,000-year-old civilizations like India and China. We can sometimes be culturally arrogant, saying we might know all the answers, right? Right. So if we could just guard against those pitfalls, and in fact take experience by living all over the world, we can build on our cultural quotient skills.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Jaspal. What we'll do now is we have time for just one more question. And so we're going to have a question here. And then, Samir, you will be available for a very short 5-minute break, I hope. And so I leave it to all your dexterity to get Samir's attention for remaining questions.
Wait, I can't stay for the drinks?
You're welcome to stay for the drinks.
Hey Samir, I really liked your talk. So one of the most important things I could think in the entire narration you did was when you came for, after so many weeks, your wife gave the baby to you. And then I think what you said was that how you broke that challenging situation is through a nanny. So other than that, traveling so much across the globe, did you crib about it every day, or how did you manage that stress itself? Or you really enjoyed it? I want to know, because my husband is also traveling most of the time.
So, you recognize that question was not just a question. It was more than just a question, so I've got to be really careful. So I think, look, I think anybody who does, and generally husbands are they travel a lot more. I would say on average, not to draw any stereotypes, but clearly Hillary Clinton traveled more than any Secretary of State. But Chelsea was not a baby, right, when that happened. So that aside, so here's how I would say, right? When you're young, at least in my case, when I was in my 30s, younger, I still think I'm young. When I was younger, travel was actually really exciting. Going to Jakarta, going to Tokyo, going to, I once did a count, I think it's like 48 countries, or 50 countries so far, right? So it's really exciting. But the 37th time that you go to Jakarta, and then the weekend where there's a coup, and it takes you 3 days to get out, it's really pretty old, right? So it's really, I think it's a young person's, fascination, but it actually gets pretty old, after some period of time. For some people, I suppose that maybe they never get tired, but I can tell you certainly where I am now, I don't really like to travel, but I do a lot, I travel a lot, and I have to because of my job. So when we had kids, the answer was a nanny, but we also kind of faced that another time. So when we moved back to the US from London the first time, we went back the second time, but when we came back in 2003, at that time, both of our careers were kind of taken off. She was at PwC, kind of on the verge of maybe being partner, and so that would have been her next, career thing. And I was kind of getting into more and more senior roles. We didn't have the nanny. She stayed back in London, so we didn't have, this is New Jersey now, right? This is where we vacuumed the house, we cleaned the toilets, hopefully that miracle thing that you talked about, maybe we're using the same things so our toilets look new, like they did when we first bought them. So that was an important decision-making point for us, and that's when actually my wife decided she's not going to work, right? So she said, I'm going to focus full-time on the kids, and she did, and then, but it's a decision that you have to kind of talk about. It's not just a de facto thing that happened. So, for us it was great because what ends up actually happening, the first year or two, you suddenly go from 2 incomes to like 1. So financially you make some adjustments. But I would say like within like year 3, we were well above what we had before, right? But what it also meant was she was not going to be a partner, right? So that was something that, she had to kind of give up, and she did. And there were a lot of other reasons why she did that, it had to do with aging parents and, things like that, right? So again, all of these things it's very personal, right? So it's pretty hard to generalize like what's a good way and a bad way. But what I would say is the best way is always talk to your wife or your spouse and really have a good understanding and a shared understanding of what you're both trying to achieve. If you don't have that, it's very disruptive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Smith. I do, and I'm conscious of time, but I do want to narrate a personal story myself. I have a 1-year-old baby at home, and my wife is a doctor, and she works crazy hours. And trust me when I say, but in her comparison, I'm a slacker because I don't work. And unfortunately, I've been in San Francisco the whole week for work. Took the red eye back this morning. I've been here all morning, and I've got like text messages from her saying, when I back, the baby's, I want the baby off me. And the answer to your question is, what do you do when, the answer is not one nanny, we have 2 nannies. One nanny, not one nanny, we have 2 nannies. We have a live-in nanny, and we have a nanny who comes during the day because we can't have the live-in nanny be available 24/7 because she has a crazy job. I'm a slacker, but we make do. So, on that note, the next session that we have is probably the only non-Indian guys. Yeah, probably the only non-Indian guys we have speaking today, and they're very excited. So what I'd like to do is take a quick break, get your coffees, but come back please, because we are conscious of time, and I want to go home. So let's just grab your coffees, come back, because we have our next sort of speakers waiting. Thank you, Samir, once again. You are very, very.
So, would our photographer,
Where's the photographer? Where's the photographer?
thank you.
Thanks again.
I'm fine.